a bit more about Dr. Coates. Her insights on applying the lessons of the humanities to national security policy are particularly relevant, highlighting the interdisciplinary approach needed in our ever-evolving security landscape. Dr. Coates is Vice President of the Kathryn and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation.
Which barely fits on a business card.
Yeah, I was going to say. Before joining Heritage, Coates served as Deputy National Security Advisor to former President Donald Trump and advised Secretary of Energy Dan Brouillette. Prior to joining the Trump administration, Dr. Coates served as a National Security Advisor for Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, Governor Rick Perry, and Senator Ted Cruz. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Victoria Coates.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Aaron and Julia. Make it sound like I can't hold a job. But for that very kind introduction, and Dr. Dash for your hospitality. I wanted to start by explaining my history with Notre Dame, which is due to that lady in white over there, who was my roommate at Williams College when we were getting our masters back in the reign of the first Queen Elizabeth. And because of Maria's family pedigree and her parents, and then her husband also being a Notre Dame grad, I learned that this was this thing called Notre Dame football. And I experienced a number of Saturday afternoons with them around the television, and then had the great good fortune of 6 or 7 years ago getting to come out here and go to a football game. And that's when I met Mike and was talking about the book I had out then, which we'll get to, which is called David Sling, A History of Democracy in 10 Works of Art. But one of the reasons I wanted to raise Maria and our checkered past is my sort of opening gambit for our discussion this evening is that if you want to become a professional in the national security field, you have to start with the PhD in Italian Renaissance art history. And I use that line frequently with groups of young people such as yourselves, and I get this blank stare. But I don't have a PhD in Italian Renaissance art history. So I say it only half facetiously because, you know, at an institution like Notre Dame, the schools that I was privileged to attend, Trinity College, Williams College, and the University of Pennsylvania. I'll come back to Penn, which I am visiting next Thursday, with a little bit more security than I have tonight. The wealth of these institutions and the richness that you can study, I think, particularly, in this field, but that you can also study other subjects as well. And that, as we discuss STEM, which is obviously the hard sciences, there's a lot of focus on making that, the sort of key element within education. My argument is not against that. I just want to add an A for arts and call it STEAM. And the reason I think that is imperative is, if we can get into this topic as well later on, as I look at our international posture right now, our big challenge is China. And particularly the current leadership of China. I don't think that is inevitable or 100 feet high, and we can talk about that too. But under current leadership, China has been, for at least the last 15 years, on a very aggressive campaign against the United States, the likes of which we've never seen. And so figuring out how we respond to that and how we ultimately win that conflict, that confrontation, whatever you want to call it, has to be the lens through which we feed all of our other decisions. How is that going to play into our overarching challenge? And so when I think about that, I think about what do we have that China doesn't? And right now, through our education system that we've grown up over the last now almost 250 years, based on obviously the university tradition coming out of Europe, is a history of teaching creative thinking and teaching innovation and collaboration and the kinds of experiences you all are living in real time right now. And obviously you can get that from political science, but you can also get it from things like art history. And so what I think we need to foster is indeed our STEM subjects. I'm fine with the hard sciences as long as somebody else is doing it. I'm not going to undermine it in any way, but not losing that creative aspect and that intellectual curiosity that is unique to our system. And the way the CCP runs education in China right now, that is not. They do not foster that. And they know it. And they're jealous of it. That's why they spend so much time over here scooping up our intellectual property, is because they don't generate it in the same way. And even if we are going into a magical, mystical future governed by AI, and I, for one, welcome our new overlords, AI doesn't create. It is ultimately derivative, and you can curate what it's deriving from. But I think what we'll find is we will use and increasingly rely on AI products, but that these are going to be a jumping off point for what the actual human brain is going to do with what the artificial intelligence generates. And so that I think is a critical feature for how we look at education going into this next century, which I am firmly convinced will be another American century. So what I thought I'd do tonight is spend as little time on my autobiography as possible, as fascinating as it is, but just give you a little sense of the path I took, because it's my understanding from Mike, you all are aspiring potential national security policymakers in various fields, and I've had the privilege now to do it both as a practitioner, but also from the angle of working for a retired cabinet secretary, working for a presidential candidate, working for a sitting senator, so Congress, from the White House, from a department, and then now from a major think tank. And so that's those sort of all the different angles that one can sort of paths, I guess is a better word, that one can take into this field, and they all have their strengths and they all have their limitations. But if you don't sort of make your way through a number of them, you don't get the full perspective. And I've found that particularly with colleagues who've stayed exclusively in the think tank world, if you've never been in the actual policy making and implementation, you have a tendency to be very abstract in your thinking because you don't have to take the consequences of your recommendations. So I am very interested in having folks embrace those kinds of experiences, and that's fascinating about you, that you are actually in the practitioner world as well as being in academia right now. So I think a very good combination. And so what happened to me, the way this kind of what I call the swerve happened, was in the, I guess, right around the spring of 2007, after the former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld retired, one of his speechwriters got in touch with me and said he wants to write a book, and he wants it to be more academic. Do you know anyone who will help him? Who would help him? And given I think you guys are probably too young to remember what was going on in 2007, but it was a very charged, poisonous time. By the standards of today, it looks somewhat tame, but it was primarily around the Iraq War, with which Rumsfeld was very closely associated. And I said, no, I don't know anybody who would help him write this book. And it's a shame, because it's an incredible American story, and I have an bizarre encyclopedic knowledge of Donald Rumsfeld. So anything you want to know, I'll be happy to tell you. At the end of his life, he used to call me when he would forget things about himself, such as his Little League batting average, which was .242. And he would say, can you make it .250? And I'd say, no. It's in the archive. So I remember actually walking up to my husband's office and saying, this is a shame. And he said, you teach at Penn. Your first book is coming out from the Getty in the spring. Is this the next 40 years? And I remember thinking, I don't think it is. And he said, I don't think it is either. Why don't you call them? And it was slightly more complicated than that, but remarkably not much. And so I embarked. And I'd done a lot of work on autobiography, particularly on Benvenuto Cellini. Again, happy to take that up in more detail. So working with a living subject with an archive that he had created was deeply humbling to my scholarship. Because as we got into it, and I would go to him with 2 documents and say, here are 2 documents. I think I have surmised, I have A and B, and I have surmised C based on this evidence. And he would be like, oh, actually, no. What you don't know about is the phone call, that I had with Kissinger or whomever it might be, in between those 2 things. And I realized as a historian how confident I was, and particularly as we get back into, Renaissance period, God forbid, an ancient period, that you are hanging your hat on very limited evidence. Now, it's all you can do. That's why you have to take that leap of scholarship is, okay, I have a couple of pieces of things, and I'm going to try to piece together an argument or, a narrative that incorporates them. But you realize how much you don't know. And so that was an extremely helpful part of that experience for me. Also working for Rumsfeld in that period, 2007 to 2013, you meet a lot of people. And so, that was kind of what gave me the springboard to start getting into practicing in the national security field. The other interesting thing about Rumsfeld, talking about doing things from different angles, is since he had been, a very young member of Congress in the Nixon administration, ambassador to NATO, White House chief of staff, Secretary of Defense the first time, private sector, and then Secretary of Defense the second time, he had done it from all different angles. So I kind of refer to it as a second PhD, spending 5 years talking to him in great detail about these things and the events that he had observed, which really ran from Pearl Harbor to 9/11. So that would be a lesson in when somebody remarkable asks you to do something, if it's a little bit outside your purview, have the courage to say yes. You've got to be brave, and you prepare to be lucky. And when it comes along, you've got to be able to embrace it. So that was how I made the leap from art history, and he was always very amused by it. It's actually in the acknowledgments for Known and Unknown, an art historian of all things. But then making the jump to starting to work for politicians. The first was Governor Perry, who was running for president. I came on board that particular train the day after UPS, so it turned out to be a short-term project. But a lesson about Perry is you never know when these people are going to come back into your life. And so I worked for him 2012, 2013 timeframe, and we had a lot of very interesting policy initiatives that he was interested in as a governor, which is a particular viewpoint that you have on things. And, Texas is a particularly interesting state from that standpoint. And then, we'll get back to Ted Cruz, which I like the shy retiring types. But what happened with Perry is he then, when Trump was elected in 2016, was interested in a cabinet post and was primarily interested in defense, but was offered energy. And I remember his saying, I'm inclined not to take it. I was like, you're crazy. You have to take it. It's this incredible portfolio. Because I started to delve into what goes on in the department and talk about what we need in the struggle with China. It needs a new name because it's not really the Department of Energy anymore. It needs a new building in the worst kind of way. But that kind of kaleidoscope of technology capabilities, there's a ton of cyber there, nuclear file. NASA is entirely reliant on the department. They can't move. They get all the press and Tang and all those things, but they can't move without DOE. It's an unbelievable asset, and he really enjoyed his tenure there. And then that's why I actually went over to DOE at the end of the last year of the administration, which was great. So as you connect with these people, they can be cyclical, but they really you'll be amazed by what you invest in these relationships and how they come back to reward you in ways you can't foresee. Another interesting kind of decision point was January of 2013. because a friend of mine that I had known for 5-6 years somewhat unexpectedly got elected to the Senate and called, or actually his first chief of staff called me and said, hey, can you come down for a couple of weeks? We're about to have some very high profile nominations. It was Chuck Hagel and John Kerry for defense and state respectively. I said, sure, I haven't done much in the Congress, and this person who had called me is a congressman named Chip Roy. And I was like, sure, I can come down and hang out with you and Ted for a couple of weeks and we'll see what happens. And the first vote was Kerry, and John McCain was chewing on everybody to make it a 99-0 vote. He referred to it publicly. It should be a coronation. And I remember Cruz looking at me and saying, how should I vote? And I said, no. I nothing personal against Senator Kerry. He is married to my home state, Teresa Heinz Kerry. He's a perfectly pleasant person, but I disagree with him very strongly on a whole series of policies. What we were discussing in that particular conversation was the law of the sea. But that was emblematic of a worldview I did not agree with. And Ted looked at me and he said, well, what if it's 98-1? And I said, you're never going to regret it. And he left. He claims he knew how he was going to vote then, but I don't know if that's true or not. Came back and I said, well, what happened? And he said it was 93-4. And I said, well, you made friends. I'm like, look at you go. But it was interesting because I knew then that he was willing to take risks that most freshman senators would not be willing to take. And he had not, at that point, he had been a domestic advisor to George W. Bush and Solicitor General of Texas, so not somebody who had done a ton in the international space and wasn't intending to, but then wound up being a major focus. So 2 weeks turned into 4.5 years, another book, another presidential campaign. So I guess the lesson there is, somebody says, can you come down for a couple of days? Say, sure. And you never know what may come of it. And both Chip and the Cruzes remain extremely dear friends and colleagues in the work that we do now. And through what I had been doing for Senator Cruz, and if you're familiar with the what to call them, gyrations of the 2015 Republican primary, Cruz and Trump did not get along terribly well during that period. But one really valuable piece of advice Senator gave his staff was to stay out of the press. He said, I don't want you signing letters. I don't want you giving interviews. This is my fight. I will fight it. You guys do your jobs. And so what came out of that when they made up after the election was having more Cruz staff than any other Senate staff go into the administration, except at first Sessions, but then when Sessions left, they all got flushed out as well. So that opportunity, which was utterly unexpected, but a huge one. And whatever your political persuasion, I would strongly recommend when you have the opportunity to get in on the ground floor of an administration, you're not going to come in as Assistant Secretary of Near Eastern Affairs, but there are various avenues to get into an administration, and I can point some of those out. Take that opportunity. It doesn't come around all the time, and it is an extraordinary experience and chance to serve your country, and that's where you really can implement policies that you find important. So that was again, unexpected swerve, but extraordinary. And landing on the NSC through that, the National Security Council staff, you have the opportunity, and again, I recommend doing that. I don't recommend doing it for more than 2 years max. It is not good for your blood pressure or hypertension or whatever. But it is, again, an amazing opportunity to serve. You're sort of at the middle of everything. You are the president's personal staff. And really the only tool he or she has to implement their policies in the departments and agencies. Because the departments are headed obviously by your cabinet secretaries. You have a thin smattering of political appointees below them, but then they are largely staffed by career bureaucrats in some cases, trying to think of sort of a better word for it, but and the perception is that those people would be naturally resistant to conservatives. I actually didn't find that to be the case. I found, a lot of patriots that were very willing to work with us. It's hard when you change an administration and you have folks who have for 4 or 8 years been asked to do one thing, and literally in one day's time, the thing that they have worked so hard on and been praised for and promoted for is gone. And those of them who have the intellectual flexibility and desire to serve country, not ideology, will be right there with you and just say, explain it to me. Tell me why you want to do this. What is our end state? What is our goal? And that was an extraordinary experience. And then the one advantage of the NSC is you hold convening power. What is that? Convening power means the NSC is the only entity that is supposed to be able to gather together different departments and agencies into a formal policy process to get to a decision from principles. And that winds up being a really powerful tool, because if you find out that those subversive folks over at the State Department, who are always up to no good, are convening interagency meetings, you can come down on them like hammer and tongs. Now, also a story about our State Department friends. One of the things that we had been instructed to do was to designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, an element in the Iranian military, as a foreign terrorist organization. Now, contrary to popular belief, you cannot designate something an FTO by fiat. It is in the power of the Secretary of State, delegated by the President, to issue the FTO, but there is a horrible process, which I do not recommend, that you have to go through, which involves a lot of lawyers to get to the level of issuing the FTO. And there was a huge amount of opposition to this, primarily actually from the Pentagon. Shouldn't blame the State Department, but it's habit, that was concerned about the precedent of designating an element of a foreign military, which was an important argument, and we listened to it very seriously. But the president and then National Security Advisor, who was John Bolton, decided they felt that the activities of the IRGC were sufficiently blatant in the terrorist field that it was worth taking that risk to designate the FTO. At which point, the opposition within the government just put up a series of roadblocks that you would not believe. And my solution to this, because I was running the policy process, was to call weekly PCC meetings at 5:30 on Friday night in person at the White House. And there is nothing the State Department hates more than going to the White House at 5:30 on a Friday afternoon. And it took us 6 weeks, and we got it done. So it was and the designation holds. And it was interesting because then candidate for President Biden on the campaign trail in 20 opened the door to revoking the IRGC FTO designation, as they did do with the Houthi designation. But then when they got back in and took a look at it, they're like, yeah, it's a duck. We're going to have to call it a duck. I'm like, yeah, it is. So again, an interesting lesson, and one that I've been thinking about a lot, that just because your predecessors, if they are of a different political persuasion, did something, it doesn't necessarily make it wrong. And so, if there is another change this November or 4 years' time or whenever, I think, my very strong counsel would be to do a thorough policy review, obviously, but judge things on their merits, not on personalities, and don't assume a different political viewpoint is going to come to an incorrect conclusion. And then finally, because I don't want to just natter at you, I'm very curious to have much more of a conversation. Coming at this from the think tank world has been very interesting. And, particularly from a heritage perspective, if you're not familiar with the Heritage Foundation, you might have read about Project 2025 in the press. It is perhaps not as dark and sinister as it has been made out to be. We're so secretive about what we're doing that we wrote a 900-page book and published it, and it's available online. It really is, 2025 is really just a transition blueprint, having experienced the 2016 transition, which was not a roaring success by my own admission, we spent half of the first year on the NSC meeting with partners and allies and who were completely baffled and confused because they had expected a different outcome and were very uncertain about what they were going to get from a Trump presidency. And if that were to happen again, we don't want to see them spend 6 months trying to explain themselves again. So actually one thing I'm doing a lot of now, I refer to them as therapy sessions with partners and allies. And I keep saying to them, what you're going to get. You've had this before. And one particularly interesting question, again, we can get into this, is what's Trump going to do with NATO? And NATO is something I've worked with a lot. Rumsfeld was ambassador to NATO in 74 and 75, or 73 and 74, slipping. But it's a fascinating alliance, unique in the history of alliances, certainly one of the most powerful and successful. But Rumsfeld was writing cables back to Kissinger in 1974 saying the Europeans are not paying what they should pay for defense. This is building a culture of dependency that will be dangerous if we don't do something about it now. Well, we didn't do anything about it, and here we are. And when we were during the administration, the president put an enormous amount of pressure on European and I will say North American partners. Canada is at all of 1.37% of GDP for defense, which is not where they should be, and had a lot of success doing that. And we had Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, come to Heritage in late January, and we did sort of a fireside chat. And I was asking him about that, and he was like, "Yeah, under Trump, we actually got more work done than we have for 25 years." And that's online, so if you want to hear his thoughts, I actually found it quite fascinating. But when I get that question, I keep saying, particularly if it's German or French, Canadian colleagues who are not making their 2%, it's like you hold that decision in your hands. If you get to 2% or you show your path, I think there is a literally 0% chance he would get out of NATO. I think the one thing that would make him consider it, and it's not an easy thing to do, he'd have to get it through the Congress, so I think there's also a political reason you wouldn't do it, but that is what would trigger him if he sees the United States expected to take a disproportionate amount of burden when you have the EU, which is roughly the equivalent size of the American economy. So, explaining some of those things is part of my current purview. Have a lot more time for sort of more forward-thinking, broader strategic projects. We were just talking about Chinese handcuffs, which is an energy project about how China, which is not only jealous of our intellectual property, but also of our energy resources and technology, is trying to shift a huge advantage for the United States into an advantage for China. It's what they do. They've gotten out the 5G playbook and they're running it again. And so, that kind of project is intellectually very rewarding. You get to work with a lot of fascinating colleagues. And then finally, the unique thing about Heritage of the big four think tanks is that it sits on Capitol Hill. So we get to tangle with all the Congress critters on a regular basis, and that's a fascinating thing. And the one other piece of advice I wanted to give you is not only to join an administration, but also, if you can, go to Capitol Hill for a period of time. If you don't want to be an actual critter, and you wouldn't stay forever, but seeing how that process works is hugely helpful, because you get to know the rhythms, the patterns, the calendar of the thing, who is actually going to help you get your project implemented. It's frequently not who you think it is, and it's almost always the appropriators. So that, I think, is also an extremely valuable piece of experience. So I was told to talk for 30 minutes.
Yep.
That was 30 minutes on the nose.
On the nose. So noted.
I am educable.
So, it'll go down in history. Horrendous talks. tend to err on the side of over rather than under. So you have laid out a very rich buffet of things to talk about, from elements of your own unique path to international
Special.
security, which I want to ask a little bit more about, to substantive policy issues, to also what I think, especially for our undergraduate fellows, will be very welcome is career advice. So the floor is open for questions of on any of those topics or anything else. So who would like to kick off the discussion, understanding that if you don't kick it off, the faculty will fill
Intervene.
the void. Faculty, like nature, abhor a vacuum. So if you don't want to hear us, you should hop in there. So
Don't be afraid.
going, please, Kathryn.
Hi, thank you for coming and talking with us today. So you've talked a bit about the importance of arts and your idea of STEAM, and specifically how humanities can contribute to the national security sphere. What do you think, or how do you think we can bring more of that humanities creative approach to these STEM majors and sort of make that a college level effort?
I think, there would probably be a couple of avenues. One thing I was thinking about in preparation for this is communication skills, which sometimes elude the hard scientists. And that's where the humanities, I think, can really contribute. So you do learn to write, hopefully, in a disciplined and effective way. And, one of the things I found develop particularly over the last 10 years is the traditional stovepipes of politics, policy, and communications are breaking down. And you might specialize in one or the other, but if you're not aware of what's going on in the other two lanes, you're going to be less effective. And so I think the humanities encourages more synthetic thinking, broader thinking than you can get in the hard sciences. And so bringing that skill. And so, as you guys are looking at what you've developed in your majors, and then if you have, concentrations in other humanities, one of the things I've learned is, take the kick me sign off your back. And one kind of funny thing that happened to me when I started becoming a little better known in Washington is about every 6 weeks a enterprising reporter would discover that I had a PhD on art history and would report this breathlessly, generally on Twitter. And one of the things Senator Cruz, who has too much time on his hands, would do is he would gather these up and then send them to me and say, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe you are actually an art historian." He thought it was funny. But at one point I was in the White House and this happened. It was a Washington Post guy, and I called a friend of mine who's much more senior at the Post and said, "This is ridiculous. You've got to stop doing this." And he said, "Oh, I don't even know this person. We all think it's really cool that you're an art historian. We think it's great." I was like, I have arrived. But from the beginning, I never tried to pretend it was anything that it wasn't, and tried to lay out the skill set I had developed. So if you think, okay, what have I learned from this? It can be language skills. It can be, statistics. There are all sorts of things that you guys are now chock full of that might not seem like it's part of a traditional portfolio, but it can really be applied, and celebrate that. Include it on your applications. Bring it up in interviews as something that is unique about you that you can contribute.
So, Victoria, Kat has not only talked the talk, but walked the walk. Because
She interviewed me.
yeah, not only a aerospace mechanical engineering major, but also a history major. Now there's some debate among social sciences as whether history is humanities or social science. My own personal view is anything worth doing is social science. But nonetheless, in her case, she's doing both. I wanted to ask you a little bit, though, specifically about the challenges the humanities face. And I was thinking about it because we were back at the University of Chicago a couple of weeks ago, and one of the classicists at Chicago had penned something of a jeremiad about the direction that Chicago is going, emphasizing the STEM, not STEAM disciplines, and also emphasizing the professional schools. And I think part of that, that seems like it's a national trend, and it's a reaction to students and parents who wonder what you can do with the humanities degree. Now, you've been very successful with a humanities degree, but a cynic might say you've done it despite that degree rather than because of it. So make the case, especially politically, about how you're going to build a coalition behind more Victoria Coates and Maria de Pasquale's in positions of power. Both art historians are in positions of power, but how did art history get you there, or some other humanities discipline?
Well, I think more Maria and Victoria is just a successful formula for pretty much anything. Well, this reminds me, I can't remember what NSC position was. The art newspaper wrote an article about it and said I was the most politically prominent art historian since Anthony Blunt. Mike, I was going to say, no, but Mike laughed too because he knows about communist spies. Anthony Blunt, who actually was my undergraduate advisor's PhD supervisor, and the keeper of the Queen's pictures, was revealed at the end of his career to be a Russian spy, a Soviet spy. So I think the art newspaper actually preferred Sir Anthony. But it's something I've thought a great deal about. And when I was at Penn, we actually had a lot of success placing students at law school. And because it was a discipline, and you could argue that, I keep coming back to being able to write clearly, coherently, and effectively, and then taking that to be communications. But when you're working in art history, you were fundamentally forming a subjective argument. You were using as much as you can to, in terms of facts, to inform your scholarship, but ultimately, you are forming your interpretation, shaped by your experiences, biases, what have you, about a particular work of art, an artist, a period of time, and that is in many ways what a lawyer has to do. And so, formulate an argument based on fragmentary evidence, make it convincing, and then carry your point. So that, I think, is part of the skill set that's useful. I also, and Kat, I'm disappointed you didn't tell me before our discussion about the history part of it, but I think a knowledge of history is so important. So for me, art history does have a bad rap. It is a bipartisan bad rap. Both Barack Obama and Marco Rubio have taken public swipes at the discipline. And it's very funny. Sorry for telling lots of nasty Ted Cruz stories, but he would appreciate it. You can hear him if he's talking about useless degrees. There'll be a pause, and I know he's thinking art history, and he's thinking, she's going to call me. Yeah, as if I say that, and then he'll say something else. basket weaving or whatever. So I think, art history, though, isn't a puff discipline. I mean, it's history with pictures. And I did, because this is a common trait of authors, want to mention my book, the David Sling book, because that became a meditation on the history of democracy. So it goes from ancient Athens, from the Parthenon to Picasso's Guernica. And it's 10 works of art that were self-consciously created to commemorate free systems of government. And what became increasingly apparent to me through the course of the book was not that only democracies can create great art. That's not the argument of the book. It's remarkable that democracies have pulled themselves together to produce, a stick figure, let alone Michelangelo's David. And so it is the exception, not the rule, but it has been this recurring phenomenon that free systems produce these self-reflective works. And that got me very much into the history of democracy. And obviously, the promotion, preservation of democracy is a vital part of United States sort of global statecraft. But it has taught me to be very cautious about that, because there are so many different types of free systems, and they succeed and fail for a whole series of different reasons. And if we take a one-size-fits-all approach to democracy promotion, I think we're doomed to failure. And the other thing is that democracy has to be the choice of the people who are practicing it. It can't be imposed. It has to grow organically, or else it's not going to work. And even if it does grow organically, in the case of, say, ancient Athens, it can fail spectacularly in a very short period of time. So that's an area where, my research and scholarship has informed the way I develop policy. And, I just would say about ancient Athens, if you want to know about it, you learn a lot from reading Thucydides, who very helpfully wrote down a lot of the smart things Pericles said. But if you want to know all about ancient Athens, you do pretty well by looking at the Parthenon, in front of which Pericles stood when he said a lot of those very smart things.
Okay. Any students out there? You're going to get more.
Very shy.
Andrew?
This is more of a personal question, but how do you see dynamics between the United States and the Caribbean, specific nations like Cuba and Haiti, shift in the coming years? And how do you feel that relations and future American policy might shift, especially given the threat that nations like Cuba pose, given recent situations like that of Manuel Rocha, the supposed eavesdropping facilities?
I know all about Manuel Rocha.
in Cuba, or the recent destabilization of the Haitian state?
No, that is a fascinating question, and one we're tangling with directly. And I have tangled with, obviously, Senator Cruz is Cuban, and so takes a particular interest not only in the island but in the region. And so, trying to figure out how to make that into a less glaring and problematic problem set has been something I've meditated on for a while. I think, when we all woke up 3 weeks ago and suddenly Haitian cannibals was on our bingo card, that came as something of a surprise. But instability in Haiti is obviously nothing new. It is a massive international failure of cataclysmic proportions. I'm not quite sure how to make it any better. And so what we're looking at right now is, and the other thing I wanted to mention in that context, well, two other things. We have the Cuba problem set. I don't know if anybody noticed, but about 3 weeks ago, we had historic protests in Cuba over the removal of food and primarily food, but also fuel subsidies, which is the same thing that provoked the Iranian protests in 2019. And where I would take fault with the current administration's approach is they said we didn't do it. Well, just say nothing. I don't care if they think we did. They're going to blame us anyway. So, maybe leave some strategic ambiguity there. And I actually wrote a op-ed with a colleague named Rob Greenway, who was my deputy and successor at the NSC and is now, not surprisingly, my deputy at Heritage, about what we could do to help, that would not be seen as an act of war. And what we had worked on with the Iranian protests in 19 was how do you provide an open but secure internet to the protesters? Because the Cuban authorities, as the Iranian authorities had done, shut down the internet. And that's how you prevent the protesters from getting their stories out. You prevent them from talking to each other and organizing. You don't do it lightly because it costs the Cuban government a huge amount of money to do that. But it shows you how seriously they took those events. They were going to shut it down. Now, it would be nice if our friend Elon Musk could just project Starlink. It's not that simple. It's worked in Ukraine, but it would not work in Cuba for a whole bunch of reasons. So they're technological hurdles, but we can get over those. And, I think making sure we have that capacity, we're willing to use it, that's us exporting free speech. And so that's what we would propose right now for Cuba. The other little factoid I wanted to mention, and it's actually a trivia question, and nobody Google. Does anyone know what the largest embassy in the world is? You can guess. I would like guesses. It was at one time the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. Do you want to guess? UK. U.S. and UK? Did you have a guess?
I was about to say U.S. and Iraq.
Yeah, it was at one time. Do you have a guess?
I have a guess. The largest U.S. embassy?
Any country.
Oh, any.
Yeah. Interesting. The Russians in Cuba. How about China in the Bahamas? 120 nautical miles from Miami. Huh. I just discovered this recently myself. Like a giant listening post. But it shows you how vital that region is, and China knows it. And that's where they're pouring their assets. So what do we have in what's obviously a pretty messy arrangement? Well, we have Puerto Rico. And interestingly, President Reagan put statehood for Puerto Rico into his 1980 platform for many of the same reasons that we're taking a particular interest in it from Heritage's perspective this year. Obviously, incredibly strategic location. It's already a U.S. territory. Population that we're very familiar with. Tremendous economic potential. They're just coming out of their post-hurricane IMF reforms. And they're also, I find this a shocking dereliction of duty, but both in terms of runways, ports, extraordinary resources that have basically been mothballed. Deep water ports, two of the longest runways in Latin America, basically unused. But there's no reason we can't dust those things off. They exist. And so we're working on something called the American Case for Puerto Rico, which is primarily economic and security. There's also an immigration part to it because Puerto Rico right now is a immigration loophole. If you can get yourself to the island, you can get on a domestic flight to the United States. And I take this personally because the person who came in from Brazil and murdered his girlfriend and then went on a rampage through southwestern Pennsylvania, which is where our family is from, had come from Brazil through Puerto Rico illegally into the United States and then committed a heinous crime and basically locked us down for 10 days, which I didn't think was a terrific development. So helping, and Puerto Rico doesn't want this to be the case. So they would like assistance with that. So those are kind of the three elements. And we're not going to take a position on statehood because I think that's a question for the people of Puerto Rico. But this is a project about how can we, help with policy recommendations that will make the island as prosperous and secure as it can be, as already a U.S. territory, and that we can, through that kind of activity, demonstrate, a beneficial partnership with the United States and really contrast with what's happening on Cuba and Haiti. It doesn't have to be that way. So that's kind of where I am.
Great. Gene Goltz?
Thanks for coming, Victoria. Nice to see you.
Good to see you too.
So I guess I was a little shocked when you said that you're, forget the phrase, your tour, you're going around, you're talking to foreign leaders.
Therapy session.
What was that?
Therapy sessions.
Therapy sessions, right. Where you were saying, you know what you're going to get, you had it before. Because at least the way it's been portrayed, or maybe the way I wishfully think, is that you didn't have it before. And it was partly, I thought, that the reason that Project 2025 exists is because of the feeling that in the last Trump administration, there wasn't a prepared bench of people who thought like the president and understood what the president wanted. And so he ended up with a lot of people in the administration, for one reason or another, we could speculate.
I actually know.
Who didn't agree, right? Who didn't want to do what Trump wanted. And I thought the idea was that this time we could actually have a real Trump administration. And that's what Project 2025 was about, was getting people to understand, getting a vision and a set of people who supported that vision. And so then now what you're telling them in your therapy sessions doesn't sound quite right, because the ideas would be different this time.
Well, that's actually a fantastic question. Project 2025 began before I came to Heritage, which was 2 years ago. And so it began well before such efforts historically have. And it isn't Heritage alone. We are at the lead of over now 100 different, yes, conservative, but a wide range of institutions. And that list is publicly available. So you can see the kind of range. It's not all the conservative nut jobs like us. We actually have some respectable members. But that predates Trump. And the policy recommendations we made in the Mandate for Leadership, this year's version or last year's version of what goes back to a 1980 tradition, I would give to anyone. I would give it to Biden if he wanted it. And they don't tend to consult me all that often. But it's, that is not Trump. And, the policies that'll be in Pillar 4, again, the stuff I've been involved with, which is primarily NSC and energy, but I advise on both state and defense. Again, I would give that to any president. The personnel side will be obviously the president's choice. What we have on that, though, isn't us selecting people. It's folks selecting themselves. People choose to enter their information in the database, which is secure. It's run by Oracle. I understand why that would be a concern. But it's, that again, we're not going to be running presidential personnel. We will simply have a list of people who want to serve in an administration. And I would say the difference from 2016, and not to get too political here, but the issue we had, and this is why Ted's advice was so good that summer, we had a whole host of folks who were George W. Bush staffers who actually knew how the federal government runs. They knew the career folks who were likely to be particularly supportive of a conservative president. They had all taken themselves off the table. And that was a huge liability, particularly in the early days, because the folks that you do want to come, bring in at your assistant secretary level, the folks who had been more junior 8 years ago, we had a real dearth of that. And I do think we should avoid that again, doing that again. And in terms of having people who oppose the president, if you are opposed to the president's policy, I think that's a good thing. I happen to support the former president's policies. So I think that caused more division and dysfunction than ideally we should have. So that was my experience.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming, Dr. Coates. I guess a question I have pertaining to think tanks, at least, is kind of thinking about changes in administrations, like how do think tanks really plan ahead? Because I'd imagine, depending on what administration's in power and also what leadership is in Congress, think tanks are going to have different amounts of influence and, also appeal, I'd assume. So I guess, how can think tanks plan ahead for the future if election results are unsure, and how can it kind of do think tanks kind of sometimes struggle to retain staff if said think tank isn't as prominent because it's a time during which their input isn't as valued?
That's a really interesting question, and it's one we're grappling with right now. You need to have a plan A and a plan B. So yes, if the election in November goes the Republican direction, there will be a giant sucking sound. And to paraphrase, who is that, Ross Perot? Who talked about the giant sucking sound. And half of our staff will depart. And we are prepared for that. But our function also radically changes because what we would then be in the business of doing, depending on the makeup of Congress, is being at the forefront at getting executive orders and that kind of thing passed through Congress as much as we can. And that's a different activity for us, but one we are poised to do, particularly for the first year or year and a half of an administration. Conversely, as Heritage, one thing we do is a ton of work with the states on education. We actually have a tremendous number of China-related initiatives that we're pursuing on the state level. So if the opposite happens, I think you'd see us focusing a great deal on state level policy initiatives and getting those passed into law, working with governors and state legislatures, which is actually where my husband's focus is in Pennsylvania. So even when, right now, conservatives are not governor, senator, or majorities in either house, which is unusual. But even so, there's a ton you can get done. And then it'll depend very much on the makeup of Congress, because again, we sit on Capitol Hill. That's our bread and butter. So, particularly if the Senate flips, that's a whole other set of engagements than we would have right now. And guess who would be the chairman of the Commerce Committee? Ted Cruz.
Please, Tommy.
Yeah, thank you for speaking with us today. One question that I had, given how in recent months there's been a lot of Republican opposition to further funding for Ukraine, and the funding has gotten stalled in Congress, do you believe that this issue, should the funding be advanced continuously to Ukraine, or do you believe that this is a distraction from like a greater focus on China and more like the domestic priorities that could be spent on?
Yeah, I thank you for the question. I would embrace the and I feel like I've been talking about Ukraine since 2014, when we woke up one morning and Crimea had been seized. And I'd like to stop talking about it, and I think the Ukrainians would like that too. So with the position we have, which goes back 2 years, is that we have zero fondness for Vladimir Putin. He has ruined too many of my weekends for me to have any fond thoughts for him. We really do not want this to happen again. We would like to stop talking about it, and we are deeply concerned about going into a NATO country. And I've spent a lot of time in and with particularly the Baltics, Poland, Romania, talking about exactly that. And they all have historical memory of this. And if you really want a powerful experience, go stand in the Lithuanian parliament with some of the folks who were there when the tanks rolled through. And they were declaring independence, and they still have what the Soviets did was their emblem is a knight on horseback, and he was in their parliament building. And the Soviets put a big Soviet star over it. Now the star has been removed, but you can still see its shadow, but they keep it there. So for them, this is deeply personal, and as I said, the stuff of immediate memory. And so making sure that we can satisfy those 3 points. My issue has been not with supporting Ukraine, because obviously they have performed remarkably. And there has been bipartisan support for training and equipping Ukraine since the 2014 timeframe. That's something that continued under both President Obama and President Trump, and I think contributed significantly to their military success. My issue is what we're giving, how we're giving it, and what our partners and allies are doing. And I think in the days 2 years ago, and conveniently, I wrote about it at the time, so I'm not just saying it now, when it was clear it was not going to be a 3-day war, and that we weren't going to be arming an insurgency and a government in exile kind of a thing. There was never a pivot to how do we win, and define victory. One of the things Stoltenberg said when he visited, he actually said it twice, so I think this was a message, is that the Ukrainians had taken back about half the territory that the Russians had taken in the original invasion, and that was probably where the map was going to fall. So if that's the NATO Secretary General, and that's where his head is, okay, is that then the end game? I mean, I'm asking, I don't know. And if that is the case, what are we putting in? And the $60 billion that's in, and I admit I've been traveling this week and I am much more familiar with what's in the Israel supplemental than what finally came out and what the speaker just issued for the Ukraine supplemental. The problem we've had with what dropped in August is it's disproportionately economic and humanitarian aid. And I think what you could get through the Congress tomorrow, and there would be tremendous value in doing it, is about a $25 billion package focused primarily on military assistance, with an explanation of how this would get to victory. So if it is the Patriots, and I love Patriot missile defense, they are fantastic. The only thing that annoys me about them is there aren't enough of them. And I keep threatening that if I were ever to be in a policymaking position again, I'm going to buy, I think, about 1,000 of them so I can deploy them wherever I want them, because everybody wants them. And sometimes you want them you want them to float, sometimes you want them on land, but I'm sick of being told, oh, they're resting or they're cycling or they're being maintained. They keep telling me they're resting. I'm like, wake them up. So we don't have unlimited capacity there. So if we are going to extend Patriot protection to Ukraine, and I can see why that could be a decisive choice, well, let's do it now. Why wasn't it a good idea 2 years ago? Where are we on these things? And so it's more been, again, a disproportionate concentration. When the president says something like, I'm going to put something in the pocket of all Ukrainians, which he did say in March of 2023, like, that is not the job of the U.S. taxpayer. And Zelensky said it best when he said, I don't need a ride, I need bullets. Okay, bullets I think we can be good for. And, especially, and I don't want to pick on them too much, I'll sort of do, but Germany and France have got to do more. The UK has been doing a pretty robust job. Poland, phenomenal. Romania, really great. The Balkans, well beyond what you could expect of them. Greece has contributed a massive amount. But unfortunately, those aren't the scale economies. The two biggest economies in the EU right now are not. And that is a problem, because this, last time I looked, is a war in Europe. And given what we are now facing in the Middle East, which anyone who tangles with the Middle East can tell you that can happen any Saturday and almost inevitably will, we're the ones who have to support that, because the Europeans are certainly not going to scratch a check for Israeli defenses, and they have said as much about Taiwan. Now, in the case of Taiwan, we have partners who are doing a whole lot more, and that is a great thing that's going on with both Japan and South Korea, and also Taiwan proper. But still, we are going to have obligations there that the Europeans are not. And so, those realities, I feel like, have not been taken into consideration, and in the way American support has been dispensed over the last 2 years, which is why I would be resistant to this current request, but not resistant to the notion of supporting Ukraine.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just a little bit of a follow-up, somewhat tangentially, but looking at U.S. foreign policy, whether that's in relation to sort of former Soviet bloc countries in the Middle East or in the Pacific, how do you balance differences in institutional memory between, former allies and regional partners and that of the American public and policymakers?
Can you give me a for instance?
So with your example of, the Lithuanian parliament, they're going to have a much stronger and sort of long-lasting institutional memory of what, Russia, former Soviet Union, is willing to do in that region, whereas I think the American public sees the Cold War as something that, has concluded, and I think our policy might reflect that. We're still not super friendly with Russia, obviously, but we have we might try to be, but
No,
I think
we did try.
Yeah, but I think we have a very different understanding of that history because it wasn't our backyard. And so how do we, in making foreign policy and working with those foreign allies and regional partners, sort of reconcile differences in local institutional memory and sort of that of the American public?
Well, but then I don't want to get stuck on semantics, but one of the things I've done is I've actually tried to eradicate the words foreign policy from my vocabulary unless I'm using it as an insult, and shift to national defense. And I am currently in the process of striking it from my title. It's like everything at Heritage, a nasty bureaucratic process to change anything, but we're going to get it done. But for in a way, because of what you're asking is, I think to communicate these things effectively to the American people, it has to be, how does this touch you where you live? And there is enough of a historical memory of the Cold War, and for those of us who lived through it, that the Russians are not our friends. And, Putin at this point polls like poison. There is no Putin. I mean, a lot of people like to think that there is some kind of pro-Putin caucus. It's extremely small. And as I said, there's not popular public support for that. And so I think particularly in the case of Ukraine, if you talk to people in terms of energy prices, this is what this is causing, that resonates with pretty much everyone. And that's why this is important and why we do not want this to go on. And so then, when you do have, the other amazing thing about the United States is obviously we are a melting pot. Because one of the reasons I know a fair amount about Lithuania is their partner state is Pennsylvania. And we have a large Lithuanian population and our National Guard partners with their military. So it's a relationship, that is very close, but we have a lot of Lithuanians, in our communities, and pretty much any one of these countries that you mentioned, has a diaspora in the United States and is focused on these issues, and then they can be great resources as well. But I would come back to explaining it to people in terms that are meaningful to them, and not making it an abstract that's being imposed by some, shadow chamber somewhere, but rather, something that does have an immediate impact on their lives. And it's one reason I shy away from saying we're going to defend democracy. And again, I like democracy. I'm an enthusiastic practitioner and of it, and I wrote a book about the history of it. But that's an abstract, and we obviously want there to be as many democracies as possible. They make our best partners and allies, but that can't be a cause to go to war. It didn't work in Iraq and Afghanistan. There were other reasons, but it didn't work because it didn't happen organically. It happened because we tried to force it to happen. And so that to me is desirable, but it can't be the main thrust of my strategy.
Please. Adam, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Coates. Thank you so much for coming today. My question's focused on China. So obviously, the Trump administration kind of represented a uptick in like bilateral competition between the U.S. and the Chinese. A lot of legislation was passed and policy taken by the Trump administration that was directly competing with the CCP and with China. Then the peculiar thing was the Biden administration came in and kind of took on the same strategy of geopolitical competition, kind of representing a bipartisan agreement that China is the United States' principal threat on the global stage. So just given your expertise and given your knowledge of working in these administrations, if President Trump were to be reelected for a second term this coming November, what sort of departures do you think would happen between the Biden administration's policy on China and a prospective President Trump administration?
I would see a ratcheting up. And from my experience, because I was primarily working on Middle East peace process, which obviously did not go well during the first year of the Trump administration, but about a quarter of my time was on the national security strategy, which was spearheaded by Dr. Nadia Shadlow. And what Nadia wanted to do with the NSS was elevate the China issue. And that is, I think, the first document that comes out and really lays out the fact that we were shifting from having counterterrorism be our primary focus, as it was post 9/11, to realizing what China had done. And again, this was one of the most humbling things, because sort of my interest in it goes back to 2011, 2012, when I learned to spell Huawei, because Governor Perry had asked Huawei to come invest in Texas, because President Bush, when he helped China get into the World Trade Organization, wanted to expand Chinese investment in the United States, particularly in Texas, and had actually asked Perry, to court Huawei, which he did, but within 4 years, that was a problem. And why it was a problem. And he never had a good answer for it, because it wasn't a problem he had foreseen. Now he has the conviction of the convert on it, but it was a problem. But when we got into the administration, the degree to what we learned was the degree of what China had been doing. And for us, it was primarily 5G, because we said, well, we have an alternative, don't we? Why can't we? No, we don't have an alternative. They've put all of your companies out of business through this. I mean, it was an incredible campaign, and we eventually cobbled something together between Ericsson, Samsung, and some other companies, and managed to kind of beat that one back. But it was shocking and it was humbling. And I think our compatriots came in and saw the same thing. And it was this sort of funny. Maria Bartiromo did an interview with the former president, 6-8 weeks ago. And, he was talking about Xi and saying, oh, Chairman Xi was a friend of mine. We got on fine. I want China to do well. And Maria looked at him and said, but you're talking about 60% tariffs. And he said, oh, it might be 70. It's a nice country you have there. And I was on her show the next day, and she played that for me. And, I was like, this is standard operating procedure. I want to get along with you. I want to be friends. And if you cross me, there's going to be a problem. I would say the biggest difference is there would not be much hope in an incoming administration that we can get to a deal on anything with the current leadership of China. And everything, that Xi has said and done over the last couple of years, and primarily with Hong Kong, but there are other instances, is not encouraging. So I don't think there would be any hope for a climate deal. I don't think we would hope that they would, and I would put much more focus on climate with India, where I think we can make significant progress, and they want help. China's not going to do anything constructive in that space. I might wish that they would, but that's not going to make it so. So I think that would be a change, but I think the fundamentals pretty much everybody agrees on, which is rare.
Okay, we have a couple of questions back there, please.
So you mentioned how the Heritage Center was going to work with different states in the future, and you just mentioned Texas, and I've learned about Hawaii a little. Oh, thank you. Learned about the different states and how they're working to contribute to national security. What do you see as the most significant states that can contribute to federal national security, and how do you think they can do that?
Oh, there are all sorts of areas. I think I mentioned education as an area that I think is much better approached from a state perspective than from a federal perspective. I think it's a better policy kind of process because you have different perspectives and different priorities for education, and so those that is a particularly important focus in terms of national security issues. I think energy is something that could be more productively dealt with in many cases from a state perspective. On China, we're working on, say, the agricultural land purchases. There are immigration issues that can be dealt with, and but they're just a whole host of things that fall under a state purview. Is there something you're particularly interested in?
I was just wondering really the difference between like the state powers influencing national security versus what the federal.
Yeah, the federal government will always take lead because in some of these things, which have a international capacity, you do need to be. It really is an executive branch function. Having tried to do it from the Congress for a number of years, it's really hard. There are certain things you can do, and you can defund things, which is always fun. But your tools are blunt, and so it does have to be ultimately an executive function. But given the strength of a lot of our states, and it's not just the big ones, obviously, Texas is the example, and Pennsylvania are the two I have the most experience with, and they are both large states. But the smaller ones can have particular mining in Utah, the sort of things that you wouldn't necessarily think of as a national security issue, but it has become so. From the smaller population-wise states, so I would see it as sort of two different approaches, both with their value, and again with the state approach, you're dealing much more, with something that is specific to the American people, because they're going to actually be voting on it, that kind of thing. So that is also, I think, productive and helpful.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Coates. So you talked about defining victory and success with respect to involvement with Ukraine and if it had morphed into supporting a counterinsurgency. Kind of shifting gears a little bit, this idea of defining success and victory has proven to be a great challenge in the seemingly endless global war on terror. Given that, I'm curious as to how you would define victory and success within the context of the global war on terror.
Yeah, I think I'd start by saying the global war on terror was a terrible name for it. It always bugged Rumsfeld. He hated it. He hated the acronym, the GWAT. But nobody ever came up with a better name, and I think there's a reason for that. Is that you're struggling against an ideology, and that if you're struggling against communism writ large, that becomes very difficult to define. If it's the Soviets and that's the Cold War, and you figure it out, that took us a decade to figure out what was going on there. That you can focus on and then define what and while there was broad bipartisan understanding of the Cold War, different presidents defined success differently, and so that can shift. None of these things are going to be set in stone, but we knew what we were fighting. The funny thing about the global war on terror is, and I thought about this a lot around the time that we were working on the Abraham Accords, is in a way the Abraham Accords represented victory in the post 9/11 period. Now that's not everybody. I mean, that's particularly the Al-Qaeda folk largely coming out of Saudi Arabia. And I'll tell you why I think this, and it's one of my favorite stories because it drags energy in. And this was in the summer of 2020 when I managed to be living in Abu Dhabi, which was a neat trick during COVID, but we got there, working as the representative for the energy secretary. And you would have thought that we always would have a representative of the Department of Energy in Abu Dhabi, but we don't. But we did that summer, not by coincidence. And I woke up on July 26th and turned on Bloomberg and learned that Chevron had purchased Noble Energy. And I thought right then, we have it. It's done. And the reason I thought that is Noble is a lovely little company. It's out of Houston, and the acquisition was about $4 billion, which on Chevron's balance sheet is a rounding error. And Chevron makes all of its money in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. And I knew there was no way that deal would have been inked if they had not had ironclad assurances from the kingdom that this was not going to be a problem, because Noble controls Israel's Eastern Med natural gas assets. And if Saudi agreed to that, regardless if they were party to the Abraham Accords, there's no way Bahrain signs and very little chance UAE signs unless they have those same assurances that Chevron got to ink that deal. If we had Saudi buy-in, it means that what attacked us on 9/11 has been defeated. Now, the rest of terrorism remains alive and well and up to horrible things. And the resurgence of ISIS, which has had spectacular attacks on both Iran and Russia this year, that's not gone and continues to require attention. But it's one of the reasons I am supportive of revisiting the 2001 AUMF, which is what largely our counterterrorism architecture has been built on, but which is specific to the post 9/11 period. I think that needs either a massive revision to the point where it would be easier to repeal and replace it, to deal with terrorism as it continues to exist, but which is different from the immediate post 9/11 period. So on the one hand, that's a hopeful answer, and that I think we did beat it. But the bad news is that doesn't mean evil is then gone. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to have to fight that. But I feel like we need to get that chapter closed to move on to what we face today.
Good note to end on. Probably
it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, a lot more topics we could talk about, but our lease on the room is expiring in a minute or two. Before I ask you all to join me in thanking Dr. Coates for kicking off the Women Inspired to Lead conference, I was also going to ask Julie and Aaron if you guys could mobilize the other Weiss members who are here so we could get a picture with Dr. Coates before everybody spreads to the winds. Christian's got a camera.
Can I actually say one thing about
Sure.
that? Is this is an area where I spend a lot of time, because far too often, still I am the only woman at the table. I am at the table, but far too often you realize, once again, and particularly if you're spending a lot of time in the Middle East, you get used to it. So, I do want to be as supportive and helpful as I can. We have a group at Heritage called the Iron Ladies. They're actually having an event I'm missing tonight on work-life balance. I told them to call me if they figured it out. But those kinds of groups are important, but not to the exclusion of our male counterparts. But my goal is that by the time y'all are as old as I am, which is a very long time from now, don't worry, that it won't even be a thought, because it will just be merit. And, the choices of the individuals going, do I want to apply for that job, which is a choice. So I am very hopeful about the trajectory, but, really happy to be supportive of you guys in any way I can back in DC. So, because it is very important to us.
Great. Well, that's a perfect note to end on. So please join me in thanking.
Thank you.